Most people think a high-yield savings account is the smart answer. It is smarter than the old answer. That is not the same as being the right answer. I want you to hold that distinction in your mind because it explains a great deal about how ordinary people get stuck in the middle of the financial ladder. They improve just enough to feel clever. They move from the terrible bank account to the less terrible bank account. They stop accepting crumbs and start accepting a somewhat larger crumb. And because the improvement is real, they stop asking the more dangerous question. Why am I still letting the bank stand between my money and the yield? It is obviously earning with that money. That is the mother line for this whole story. The bank is still the middleman. The traditional savings account just insults you openly. The high-yield savings account insults you more politely. That is the difference. A person with a terrible bank account is being underpaid, so obviously that the harm should be embarrassing. The rate looks microscopic. The annual interest feels decorative. The monthly deposit barely buys lunch. Yet the person still feels responsible because the money is safe. Because there is a little interest, because a savings account sounds like prudence, and because the banking system has done an excellent job teaching people to confuse custody with partnership. It is not a partnership. You are renting your money to them, and they are paying you far less than they can earn with it. That is the basic business model. I have always found it amazing that people work so hard to save money and then become almost completely incurious about what happens to that money. The moment it lands in a bank, they picture it sitting in some quiet vault waiting for their return. It is not waiting. The bank puts it to work. It lends it. It buys safe government paper with it. It stacks spreads on top of spreads. It clips fees from the same customers whose deposits fund its balance sheet. Then it gives you your tiny share and calls it yield. That is not yield in the meaningful sense. That is a wage for passivity. Now, when someone discovers how absurdly bad a traditional savings account really is, the first upgrade is often a high-yield savings account. Good. That is an improvement. I am not mocking the improvement. If one account pays almost nothing and another pays 10 times more, the second is better. If you can move from insult to decency with a few clicks, you should. I respect people who take the first step, but I have very little patience for treating the first step like the finish line. That is where Jordan made his mistake. He saw a rate around 4.5%, moved his money, and felt as though he had solved the problem. In one sense, he had relative to the person getting a fraction of 1%. He looked informed. He was informed. But the deeper structure had not changed. The bank was still sitting between Jordan and the underlying return stream. It was still gathering his deposit, putting that money into its own machine, and deciding how much of the economics to share back with him. A better seat in the same machine is still the same machine. That is the key, and the machine is built on spread. Banks take your deposit and pay you a little. Then they earn more, sometimes much more. They lend that money through credit cards, auto loans, mortgages, personal loans, and every other channel where ordinary people pay up for access. They buy short-term government securities. They collect interchange fees when you swipe cards. They earn from float, from timing, from fees, from data, from structure. The customer thinks he is using a safe storage product. The bank knows it is running a profit engine fed by customer inertia. That is why I keep coming back to one question. What can the bank do with your cash that you can legally and practically do for yourself? For a very large part of your idle savings, the answer is surprisingly simple. It can buy short-term treasury paper. And so can you. This is where the entire game changes, because once you understand that point, you stop arguing about which savings account is less insulting and start asking whether you need the bank in that middle position at all. That is an adult question. The childlike question is, which bank pays the best rate this week? The adult question is, what is the actual source of the yield, and why am I giving a cut of it to someone else if I can hold the underlying asset more directly? That is what Maya never asked. That is what Jordan almost asked, but not quite. And that is where most people remain stuck. A savings account rate, whether terrible or decent, is still an advertised number controlled by the bank. The bank can move it up when competition demands it. It can move it down when your attention drifts elsewhere. It can use promotional language, teaser rates, tiered balances, and all the other little tricks that let institutions market an attractive headline while preserving room for themselves underneath the surface. The customer feels rewarded, the bank feels in control. That arrangement is not accidental. Now, I want to be precise, because precision matters here. I am not saying a high-yield savings account is useless. Far from it. For everyday simplicity, for people who need absolute convenience, for those who want money parked in a familiar place while they learn the system. A high-yield account is much better than the old giant bank garbage rate. It can be a fine temporary home. It can even be a reasonable permanent choice for someone who values one. Stop simplicity more than squeezing every last basis point out of the structure. What I am saying is narrower and more important. You should understand that the high-yield account is not the source. It is a pass-through. The bank is taking your money, putting it to work in assets and loans, and sharing a slice. Once you know that, you can evaluate whether that slice is worth the convenience. And for a great many people with meaningful idle cash, the answer becomes no. Now let us talk about direct alternatives, because this is where people tend to get nervous, even though the actual ideas are not complicated at all. Short-term Treasury exposure is the obvious place to start. Why? Because Treasury bills are among the simplest, cleanest places in the financial system where cash can go to earn a market-driven, short-term government yield without first stopping at the bank's toll booth. If the bank is taking deposits, buying short-term treasuries, and paying you less than those treasuries yield, then one logical response is very simple. Buy the treasuries yourself, not because it is exotic, because it is direct. There are several ways to do that. You can own the bills directly through the government's own platform if you are comfortable dealing with maturity dates and the slight administrative friction. Or you can use a treasury, bill ETF or a treasury-only money market fund, and let the brokerage infrastructure handle the operational details. Different wrappers, same basic idea. Cut down or eliminate the bank's role as a middleman between your idle cash and short-duration government yield. That is the real leap in understanding, not find a better savings account. Understand the plumbing. Once you understand the plumbing, you stop acting like a customer choosing among products and start acting like an allocator choosing where your cash should actually live. That is a much more powerful identity. Now I want to address the emotional objections, because people always have them. The first one is safety. My savings account is insured. Fine, that matters. I respect that. But what exactly do you think sits underneath that insurance structure? The same sovereign system whose short-term debt you would be owning more directly if you bought treasury bills. In other words, the psychological gap between bank account protected by the government and short-term government paper owned more directly is often larger than the actual credit distinction the average saver is trying to make. The second objection is access. I need instant liquidity. Fine again, but be honest about your actual emergency behavior. Do you really need your entire idle reserve in spendable checking account form within 60 seconds? Probably not. You need layers. Transaction cash for the week, working cash for the month, emergency cash for the real surprises. Beyond that, the idea that every dollar must sit in the easiest possible place often becomes a habit, not a necessity. 1 or 2 business days of settlement is not the same as being trapped. It is just slightly less frictionless than swiping a card. The third objection is simplicity. This one I take most seriously because simplicity has real value. A good system that you actually use is better than a theoretically perfect system that you never finish setting up. I do not want people pretending to be sophisticated while building fragile, overcomplicated routines. They abandon the first time life gets busy. But simplicity is not the same as complacency. It is entirely possible to build a cash system that remains simple while also refusing to let the bank keep taking an unnecessary cut from the safest segment of your balance sheet. That is what mature money management looks like. Not complexity for its own sake. Intentional structure. And I want to say something deeper here, because this subject is about more than rates. It is about how you think. Most people never graduate from product thinking to system thinking. Product thinking asks, which account is best? System thinking asks, What role does this money play? What yield should it reasonably earn? How liquid does it really need to be? What tax treatment applies? And who is clipping spread unnecessarily between me and the underlying return? That second set of questions changes your whole financial life. You stop accepting products at face value. You start examining the economic arrangement behind them. That is exactly the mindset wealthy people use all the time. They do not merely ask what something pays. They ask what structure produces that payment and who gets paid before they do. This is why taxes matter here too. A person who chases only the headline rate can easily miss the after-tax reality. A savings account may advertise a stronger number, but its interest is fully taxed as ordinary income, including at the state level where applicable Treasury income often carries a different treatment. That does not automatically make one option superior in all cases, but it does prove the larger point. Again, the sticker is not the truth. The net result is the truth. That is why I care about after-tax yield, liquidity, stability, and middleman cost all at once. Money should be managed like a balance sheet, not like a sale flyer. Now, let me explain the exact mistake ordinary savers make. They think in categories that are too broad. Checking, savings, investing. That is fine when you are 16. It is not fine when you are trying to run a serious life. A much better framework is this: transaction money, emergency money, idle reserve money, near-term opportunity money, longer-term investment money. Each of those jobs deserves a different home. Your transaction money belongs in the account designed for transactions. Your emergency money belongs where it remains safe and reasonably liquid. Your idle reserve money should not sit wherever a marketing department told you to park it. It should sit where the structure is strongest and the middleman tax is weakest. Your longer-term investment money belongs in productive assets, where time and compounding can actually matter. Once you see those layers, the entire savings account debate becomes much smaller and much clearer. A savings account is not an identity. It is just one possible parking lot for one category of money. The question is whether that parking lot deserves the money you left there. That is all. And for a surprising number of people, the answer is no. So what would I actually do? I would keep a normal checking account for the ordinary churn of life. I would keep some immediate cash where I can reach it fast without thinking. Then I would identify the money that is not truly needed today, but is still supposed to remain stable and reasonably liquid. That is the money I would stop treating lazily. That is the money I would compare across a high-yield savings account, a Treasury bill ETF, a Treasury only money market fund, or direct Treasury exposure, depending on my preferences for convenience, tax treatment, and control. I would not make this decision by habit. I would make it by job description. That is the difference between having money and managing money. Now, let me leave you with the clearest sentence I can. The smartest move is not finding a less insulting bank account. The smartest move is understanding whether the bank needs to be in the middle at all. Once you ask that question seriously, the whole subject changes. You stop being Maya, grateful for crumbs. You stop being Jordan, proud of a better crumb. You start becoming the kind of person who understands how the yield is produced and chooses how much of it to keep. That is a much better place to stand. Not because it makes you clever, because it finally makes your idle cash work in a way that is aligned with you instead of quietly aligned with the bank's profit machine. And once you see that machine clearly, it becomes much harder to keep feeding it out of laziness.